Welcome to Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. I'm Spencer Critchley.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lewis.
And I'm Zach Friend.
Well, guys, I've been thinking a lot about something that a lot of people consider an oxymoron, and that's morality and politics. It's come up in a variety of ways, and it's actually come up for me over a period of many years. And the fact that people think it is an oxymoron, meaning they assume there is no morality in politics, I think is a problem. And I think it's just wrong. And I actually think in the end, it's not very smart. And that's what I want to talk about, because I know talking about this subject with both of you, you've had experiences like this. None of us, I think, has any illusions about what goes on in politics. But I know we've had lots of experiences, each of us, where we've seen that actually people do make moral decisions, believe it or not. And you kind of have to, or else it doesn't work. So that's what I thought we could talk about. There's so much stuff going on in the news that could easily make people cynical. And I think people should be skeptical. But I think cynicism is just wrong in all kinds of ways. So I wanted to talk about that. So let me start with Zach this time. Zach, I know you have all kinds of well-earned reasons to be cynical, as does Kev. But I actually don't think you are cynical in the end, and I'd like you to tell me a little bit about your perspective on this.
Yeah, I appreciate this question because I actually think that a lot of the country, a lot of voters, a lot of engaged members of the electorate actually look at the world through a moral construct. And so as somebody who is an elected official and has worked on a lot of campaigns, I think that just from a pure strategy standpoint, it actually makes sense to engage in a similar way. Now, that's a pure process standpoint, but I mean, let me speak from a broader standpoint, from a legislative standpoint, which is that I think that, quite frankly, most people that get into the world of public service do it for the right reasons, and the ones that don't maybe have an outsized, amplified voice right now in some of the national media, and I think that there's also they're rewarded for greater bombast or cynicism in a way that honestly, they may not even actually hold those truths to be self-evident to themselves. I mean, when I've had conversations with some of the what I would argue would be some of the sort of most extreme members in my state, that there's sort of a one personality when they're talking to the media and another personality when you're having a one-on-one conversation to them. So they're rewarded for said activity. But I really think that people do run for office for the right reasons, try and legislate for the right reasons. And even with all the challenges in the American system through special interests and the way that financing goes, et cetera, at the end of the day, I think we tend to notice and amplify when decisions that are made that are inappropriate, and we ignore the literally tens of thousands of votes that are cast at the local, state, national level for the right thing every single day across the country because it doesn't really make the news. But I do think that most folks that run really do engage in a true moral sense.
What do you think, Kev?
Thinking about what it takes to go into public service with the understanding that you're representing people and you have a desire to make things better. And I think what sometimes gets conflated is because someone doesn't agree with your style of doing something or your policy, then someone might say that might be immoral because your values don't align with mine. And I think there are going to be times in politics where values aren't going to be aligned, policy is not going to be aligned. And sometimes it's a jump to say that there's a lack of morality. I think sometimes the influx of money that's in politics and what's influencing certain people sometimes gives the impression that there's a lack of morality or people aren't doing it for the right reasons. But I believe that at its core, and the politicians that I've worked with in the time that I've served in government and in politics and the campaigns that I've served on, I felt like I was surrounded by folks who are immensely moral and getting the public service for reasons where they want to make things better. There are even instances where I didn't necessarily agree with someone who was on the other side of the aisle, but I didn't always jump to the fact to say that they're not moral. Now, that doesn't mean that there are immoral people who are currently serving, I often tell people, it's the House of Representatives, and they represent different people within the country. And everyone may not be on the same page when it comes to acting morally. So I think there's, just to kind of close it up, I think there are individuals who may be immoral, but I think it's false to say that politics is immoral.
Yeah, and I think that this is part of my concern because it's a death spiral, basically. If you assume everybody's corrupt, you create a market opportunity for people who actually are corrupt to exploit that assumption, right? So I think now we actually are facing a moral crisis in much of our politics. I think, the Republican Party currently, in its current state, is morally bankrupt, in my opinion. That doesn't mean every Republican, certainly not every Republican voter, is morally bankrupt. But the party itself, I think, has lost its moral core. When you're trying to elect, Speaker of the House candidates who have actively plotted to overthrow democracy, I think that's a moral crisis. But as I say, I think to some extent we're in this situation because of the cynicism that's been there for such a long time. Kev, you mentioned that you've worked with people who were moral. The three of us have. And I know that when a lot of people hear that, they think, oh, well, of course he would say that. Kevin McCarthy says stuff like that. Matt Gaetz says stuff like that. Of course he would say that. He's in politics. But I happen to know that what you're saying is true. I've seen it myself. Can either of you tell me stories that might make that seem a little more credible to people, as opposed to you just asserting that it's true? So who wants to go first? I've got stories like that. Who'd like to give me an anecdote that indicates that no, as wise as you may think it is to assume they're all crooks, I've seen with my own eyes that is not always the case.
I want to defer to the currently active public servant on the interview right now. So I'm going to pitch it over to Zach, and then I'll follow up.
Well, I'll sort of talk about two different things. One of them, and I know that both of you would remember this, but when working for then Senator Obama on the 2008 campaign, he would say repeatedly that good policy is good politics, meaning that doing the right thing actually is even good from an electoral standpoint. He truly believed that. And, I think there's a million examples from the 2008 campaign, obviously a transformational campaign in a lot of ways, both in approach and message. But, he faced decisions, if you think about Reverend Wright or some other issues, that he just approached it head on. It would have been a lot easier to take the easy road that the talking heads on television wanted him to do when we were in Pennsylvania, actually, at the time. And instead, he gave context to the complexity of the issue and explained from a moral perspective, by the way, and had no issue invoking both his moral core and North Star as well as his religious beliefs in those speeches as to why the outcome needed to be the outcome that it was. And I'll speak from my own perspective. I've been casting votes for 11 years, and I can easily say that there's only been one vote in that entire time that I even questioned myself a little bit at the end of it about whether it was the correct approach from, I guess, a moral or ethical standard. And the complexity was just the fact that even though I knew that the end result of the vote was correct, I thought the process leading to it wasn't. And that's the nuance of that situation. That's as far as I've come to even questioning whether I'm doing the right thing. Obviously, I'm going to think that about myself all the time, but I do know that I've seen my colleagues grapple with what they think is right versus what's expedient, or what's right and what might advantage them moving on, or what's right and what might make their life easier, right? And this is one of the challenges of the greater political construct. You can't watch a television show or a movie and have an honest politician portrayed. There isn't like a hero. The West Wing was sort of like an outlier. Things are much more about House of Cards. This is how society creates these images in part, and the media amplifies the decision making, or actually rationalizes, if it's convenient, the poor decision making of some electeds as to why they're doing it, and it's the other side that's just trying to bring them down. But I think that at the grassroots, as somebody who's engaging right now with hundreds and hundreds of electeds across the country all the time, that's what I do. I really do think that people are overall driven by the right thing, and yet that isn't, for some reason, permeating throughout the country, or the sort of ethos as to the way electeds are.
I gotta respond to a couple of those things, Kev, before I throw it to you. First of all, that point that people actually want politicians who do the right thing, that's actually the market opportunity. You know, you may disagree about what the right thing is, obviously. And you can disagree very strongly, but people want politicians who are apparently behaving based on moral principles, and it makes them furious when they feel like they're not getting that. And so-called savvy politicians who think they're being smart by being shifty, I'm not being sort of all wide-eyed here and innocent. I'm saying I think that's dumb. I think they're missing the market opportunity, and somebody like Obama really demonstrates the power when you are seen to be standing up for what you believe to be the right thing, even if they disagree with you about what that right thing is. And the other thing is, I think the toxic effect of television and movies, which we tend to assume are not the enormous educational force they are, for good or ill. And people actually think they understand how politics works based on what they see on TV and in movies, just like they think they understand how all kinds of things work based on what they see on TV and movies. It's a big reason why Trump got elected, right? Is people thought he was actually a super successful businessman because they'd seen him on The Apprentice. And so they go in assuming that it's the way it's shown on TV. And as Zach, as you said, that you can't have a politician character on TV, it seems, who's not a crook, except The West Wing. And I'll close with this for now anyway. I had the experience, and I think many people had the experience, it was almost spooky on the Obama campaign how much like The West Wing it was. because it was full of idealistic people working their hearts out to do the right thing, and people who were also very smart and very good at their jobs, but who were completely committed to doing the right thing, as hard as that is to imagine, I think, based on the cynical conventional wisdom that's out there. So Kev, I'll let you take it up.
So I actually want to, I often try not to delve too deep into like groupthink, because I think it's going to be very easy to agree with you on all of those points. And I'm actually going to challenge you a little bit when we talk about what's right and what's wrong. And sometimes it's a lot clearer, especially for folks in this conversation, to decipher. But sometimes it's just really not, and it's more of a dilemma where some things, both answers are not going to be great, right? And I think if you want to be able to, I think if we're looking for any healing or any like path forward when it comes to the country, I think we need to probably do more listening and understanding where the other person or where the other perspective is coming from on certain things, and jumping into, and not, no one here is doing that, but like jumping into, well, this is right and that is wrong, and an entire group is this or that it's easier to do. I think the hardest part, and Zach knows this more than I do, when governing or trying to put forth a piece of legislation, is we need to find some level of compromise, and I need to hear what your concerns are, and we need to find something that addresses my concern, addresses your concern, because if we're still in this for the right reasons, it's to make things better, and in a way that benefits our constituents or the people that we're representing.
Kevin, can I ask a follow-up to that? So how do we reconcile, I agree with you, so how do I reconcile as an elected, where polling data shows that, I've seen polling data that says 80% of folks want politicians to compromise, and in the same poll, they'll say that they think that the other party is literally evil incarnate, right? So how do you reconcile the same person being polled saying that they want me to compromise with the quote unquote other side while also saying that the other side is so evil, they couldn't even imagine sitting at a dinner table across from them.
I think we just look, I don't think that there's any easy way to do this. It is hard in this current environment to be a politician. If we're lobbing the same insults or the same characterizations to folks on the other side, then it will make it impossible or make it more of a challenge to compromise. Because why would you want to compromise with that person? Last week, you just said that that person is intolerable, ignorant, immoral, whatever it is. So why would you want to? And that's why, even though it's, it's I don't want to say easier, but it's. I can see why folks would want to use certain framing and certain descriptions for folks who may not agree with you. But it does, feeding that negative energy, even if you feel like you're doing it for the right reasons, is contributing to the bigger problem, which is we're not listening to each other and we're not trying to find pathways for us to be somewhat on the same page, because it is not helping anyone in this country for us not to have a Speaker of the House. Does that mean I think that, Hakeem Jeffries and Democrats need to go and bail out Republicans, which I think is ridiculous? No, I don't think that at all. But I think there needs to just be more of I think there needs to be more of a conversation around how do we not vilify each other? So when there are times when we need to work together to provide funding for, certain humanitarian issues that are going around in the world, or, fund issues that we're having right here domestically, either at the border or right in our communities. If we keep lobbing these characterizations and insults at each other, I can't possibly sit down with you. And why would my constituents want to? And I think to go back to Spencer's other point when he asked, instances of morality, I think that the politically expedient thing or the more beneficial thing for President Obama to do in his first term was probably to solely focus on the economy. And what he also knew, maybe through his personal experience with his mother and hearing stories and his time in the Senate, time in Illinois, healthcare became a huge focus for him. And it cost Democrats it cost them the majority in the end. And it took several years, and he kind of told us, he said, you may not see it right now, but in a few years, there are going to be these stories of individuals who are going to be significantly benefiting from the policy that we put forth through Obamacare, through the Affordable Care Act. And it was a tough thing to do. And folks on the other side for him were, again, making up all kinds of nonsense about what it was. But what he charged his administration to do, and the folks who are pushing the message on this, is to tell our story better. And it's going to be easier for us to kind of fight them and, fight fire with fire. But if we tell our story and we allow the policy, and we talk more about the policy to people impacted by that policy, in the end, that will prevail. I think that's what also, it could have been a very different story where healthcare could have been his downfall, but we dug in, did a way better job of telling the story of how it was benefiting the American people and the benefits that, working on the economy, how it impacted the economy as well. And I think we ended up on top, and we ended up, having a second term. So,
yeah, I think that, and I'm really glad you raised those points, Kev, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what the moral dimension of politics is or should be, and confusion about what morality is. And one way to say it, I think, is morality isn't the answer; it's the process. And this is a risk, among some folks on the left, is thinking that we can know for sure what the right answer is. And if you disagree with that right answer, you can only be mistaken or corrupt. Those are the only two possibilities, because we know what the right answer is. And it's very similar to what you see on the right. It's got a religious characteristic to it, a fundamentalist religious characteristic to it, where you believe you have come up with religion is a set of strict rules that give nothing but the right answers, and anybody who disagrees with you is an infidel. And I actually think that we see that happening. This is not both sidesism, by the way. We have a terrible crisis on the right now, but you see it on the left as well, where morality is the right answer, not the process by which you get there. And I think it's much more about that process, which I think is fundamental to liberalism. So, getting back to Obama and healthcare, on the right, they were making up stories about death panels. But on the left, you had people accusing Obama of selling out to big pharma when he didn't achieve single-payer healthcare nationally. And the only explanation for that for them was he had been bought off by big pharma, which of course was not true. And this gets to what you're saying, Kevin. I think that when you're actually doing politics, you are dealing with the complexities of real life with real people's lives at stake in many cases, as in the case of healthcare, or whether we go to war or not, or all kinds of decisions, poverty. And you are not an absolute dictator, so you don't get to just decree what's going to happen.
I think for me, is as long as there's humanity behind what you're thinking and what you're doing, which I think you're touching on that point in every aspect of your answer. I think when folks have that in mind, then I think you're on the right track. And I do appreciate that you said morality is the process. I was describing the process and you were giving it the name. And I think part of the process is the listening, is the understanding that, even going into these conversations, I might be wrong instead of I know you're wrong. Right. And when I say humanity, it's a respect, right? It's a respect of not saying that, oh, this person's a fill in the blank, negative, deplorable thing. It's, wow, they feel really strongly about this thing. And I might not be as close to it as I think I am, but let's at least have a conversation. Now, here's where I have a line, and the line is actually much further away than this. You want to cause an insurrection in my country? That's a non-starter for me, right? And I think we need to, and this is the one of the challenges with the current state of politics is we have to, we've lost our way in a sense, because there's some basic things that are just un-American or immoral that we used to be on the same page about, and just folks far left, far right are dominating those conversations, and they're much louder, even though they're a lot fewer. And I think that's something else. It'd be interesting for maybe this group or another conversation to go into, is like, how do you stamp out the folks who are so far fringe, who are hurting this country and hurting the process, right? Because when I say hurting this country, you're hurting the process because you're not allowing us to, pass bills that allow us to fund the government and things like that we need,
Part of the problem, I think, is that, and I think another aspect of the issue here is that you just said far left versus far right, and I think that makes people think, oh, so you're saying the answer is in this mushy middle where you're just kind of a centrist Democrat or you're a compassionate conservative or something. And a lot of people would say, well, you're just compromising on principle and you don't stand for anything. And liberals, broadly defined, have a reputation for it's kind of hard to tell what they stand for sometimes. And I think it would be helpful if liberals could clarify what that is. Because this one-dimensional view of politics, as if there's only one axis, right? You have to be somewhere on this axis from the far left to the far right. And that defines everything, which means that if you're on the far left, you're probably too radical. If you're on the far right, you're probably too radical on the right. I actually think that there's more than one axis, and that's part of why we're confused. So if you define the axis as liberalism, broadly defined, not just the left, but liberalism as in liberal democracy, the philosophy of individual rights and equality and freedom, and rule of law democracy, that kind of liberalism that we used to all believe in, you can be very far left. You can be very progressive, and you're still a liberal. And you can be very far right. You can be a libertarian who believes in the smallest possible government and the maximum amount of individual freedom. And you're still a liberal as long as you believe in those basic principles of individual freedom and equality and rule of law and democracy, etc. But there's a growing number of people who no longer believe in liberalism, and I think that's part of the problem. Because there are people on the left who explicitly think liberalism is just the polite mask of exploitive capitalism, and we need to do away with liberalism. And that's where a lot of the intolerance, in my view, on the left comes from. They would see any kind of compromise with people on the right as a form of either serious error or corruption. And on the right, you see a similar sort of illiberal movement, which is a lot of what MAGA is, which is people openly saying they admire Putin or Orban in Hungary, people like this, because they believe there is a morally right answer, and tolerance with people who are immoral, in their view, all Democrats, is morally wrong. And I think that's where part of this difficulty is, because I think liberalism itself feels to people like it has no moral center. Because it's kind of its downfall, because liberalism is so all-encompassing. You can be like Bernie Sanders or, a very far right libertarian, and you're part of the liberal family as long as you believe in those core principles. But that doesn't mean there's no moral core, because I think that the idea that each of us has the same rights, that we're all of equal value, that we resolve our differences peacefully, and we believe in the rule of law, and that everybody gets to vote. That's a moral code, right? And I think, to me, that's where a lot of this confusion is. And so we don't have to just say, can't we all just be moderates? It's when you stop believing in tolerance of disagreement, or you start to believe that corruption and cheating and lying is okay in the service of whatever you think is more important. That's where I think we lose the core of democracy, essentially. And I'll tell you, at the local level as well, I when I was doing a lot of this kind of work for clients, not just national clients, but a lot of local and state level clients here in California, the number of times I heard reporters, and I'd like to hear both of you on this subject, how this affects reporters, how you get it from reporters and the way reporters look at the world in your experience. Number of times I heard reporters expressing the opinion, well, we just assume that you're lying. As if there is no moral center to any of this stuff.
Well, I think as a reporter, you naturally are skeptical and you ask questions.
But that's what I mean by the difference between skepticism and cynicism. Because cynicism is that function could be performed by an algorithm, a simple algorithm. Mm-hmm. You could write the code right now. It'd just be a few lines. Public official says something. Public official says X. Assume X is untrue. That requires no thought at all. Whereas checking to see if it's actually true requires some work. And so skepticism is checking to see if it's true, which you absolutely should do if you're a reporter. But cynicism is just assuming it's untrue. Then you don't have to do any work at all. But my larger point, I think, is that's another value. Like liberalism has a moral core, and it doesn't work when that moral core is missing. And these are just sort of examples of that.
I think that's also a tricky example too, because if reporters have been accustomed to working with certain public officials who have not been truthful, or when there's certain communities, I'll give you an example. So when I served in the Department of Justice, there were a series of officer-involved shootings and killing of African-American males happening around the country in a higher frequency than normal, at least being reported in a higher frequency than normal during that time. And a lot of times when you're doing investigations, Spencer, you know this, Zach, I think you know this as well, you cannot disclose certain information because it will impact the investigation. but there's a lack of trust within certain communities, especially when it comes to, public officials, because they kind of feel like everybody's in it to look out for themselves. Because there have been instances where the DA has happened to be talking to the police chief, right? And there have been instances where, injustice was happening within a justice system. This is the reason why they have consent decrees and you have the federal government putting policies and changes in place at the local level because there have been instances of wrongdoing happening within, police departments or, various like law enforcement offices. So anyway, I digress. So part of what we had to do.
Completely on point. I think that's completely on point. And that's a case where skepticism, in my view, is completely justified. There wasn't enough skepticism in the past. And as you know, all three of us, I know all three of us have dealt with that issue from various directions a lot. And absolutely, people should be skeptical. Reporters should be skeptical all the time. The old saying in the news business is, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. Is just the old saying. But that's skepticism. That's the work of checking it out. So, I think Black people should be skeptical about policing, given the history so far. Now, that does not mean you should assume, obviously, that every cop is a racist thug. But that's cynicism, and that's now you're just not bothering to think, or you're not bothering to check everything out.
I think it's even more complicated than that. I think when you have a history of or pattern in practice of mistrust between various communities, then whether me saying it's right or wrong for you to feel that way is. Or there's times when I was when I was serving in the Department of Justice. I think this is when I was press secretary at the time. There are times when there were protests happening outside the Department of Justice. All the while, we are trying our hardest, with the Attorney General to have a presence on a local level when it came to these officer-involved shootings. And we are putting pressure on, law enforcement to take a deep look at what they're doing. And we're also in many cases investigating those departments. So we're doing all the things, but what was missing, and this is the point I want to get to, what was missing was that level of trust. How are you injecting trust and understanding in a situation where it's not understandable? Someone's child died, and there were times where I had to go out and talk to mothers who lost their child to, at the hands of an officer. I work at the Department of Justice. I work for the top cop in the entire country. So I'm far from anti law enforcement, but we also represent the American people, and we also need to show that, someone's there listening, and there's another arm of, government looking into what's going on, especially when that trust is frayed. And then we took it a step further to find instances where we can bring different communities within communities together to kind of say hey, how do we prevent this from happening again? But if I get upset, if I were to get upset with the mom who's protesting outside the Department of Justice and saying, hey, we're doing everything that we can, how dare you, put that protest somewhere else. And there's just deep hurt happening. And she had to look at me. She's like, I hope you understand what I'm going through. And I said, ma'am, I could only fathom, I just I think my son was just born maybe months before I had to do that. And it truly impacted me. And so and I think I just want to be mindful not to judge anyone for why they show up where they are. And I think going back to Spencer's point about the process, and it's how do we just find more opportunities to listen to each other? And, Zach, I don't know if that's something that you've experienced also during your time in public office, where you've had to convene different groups that may not have agreed with each other or maybe on the opposite sides. I mean, I'm talking about outside of politicians themselves, but What was that like? Do you have examples of just bringing two different factions together and then having an opportunity to hear each other, and then what the result of that might have been?
Well, Kevin, before I was in elected office for about a decade, I was the PIO for a law enforcement agency. So I have an intimate knowledge with exactly what you're talking about, including doing death notifications and doing community meetings after kids were killed or women were sexually assaulted, and dealing with the inherent and understandable distrust of the institution that was charged with trying to remedy the situation, recognizing that even the remedy isn't an actual remedy, right? I mean, at the end of the day, an arrest doesn't undo the action. Slightly different from law enforcement related actions that caused the harm of what you're talking about. These were community driven, but still the inherent distrust around law enforcement being the driver. In California, where I was working at the time, you know, also a lot of non-citizens not very interested in reaching out to the law enforcement agency with the information that they may have regarding a certain act of violence because they didn't trust local law enforcement, that they wouldn't be turned in, that something wouldn't be used against them, etc. So there's a whole host of challenging conversations. And in fact, I actually will say that it was probably the best training possible that I could have had for elective office, because you're always in a crisis situation. You're able to determine the difference between what's important and what's urgent, which aren't always the same thing. You become a little bit of impervious toward public groupthink. I mean, just remember, it's you're elected for your judgment. In theory, you're not elected to just simply do what the majority of people are asking you to do. And one of the things that you're in those situations is trying to distill the important stuff in imperfect scenario, or say during COVID, you're making decisions as you go that have real impacts on folks' lives with imperfect information. I mean, that's the nature also of public safety and crisis response. But I think that, to go back to a point that you had raised, or an issue you had raised some time back, I think one of the overall challenges, because the ultimate question is, how do we get out of what Spencer called a moral crisis within the country, and you had alluded to that we're in a situation where you've got disagreement over whether or not overthrowing the government is an acceptable means of approach in democracy, is more of a question of what things that are within our institutional control can actually prevent that being an ethos that's permeated the country, I think is the broader question. And for me, as we had mentioned in the last pod that we did, I mean, the breakdown of the media to me is a massive problem here. Because I've always felt a real responsibility in engaging with the media as really an equal partner in the entire process of what I do. But that is not, I mean, that clearly isn't held anymore, nor is it rewarded. Additionally, the overall breakdown of institutions and distrust of institutions is well beyond government. I mean, I've had conversations with faith leaders that are saying that they cannot believe the interactions they're having with their own congregations. I mean, just the expectations that they become a lot more political in their engagement, the expectations that they need to use it for things other than, I mean, even just raising local meals for the food bank has become weaponized or politicized, and things that are core to the tenets of the individual faith. Try having conversations with school leaders right now about what it's like to try and run a public school in the United States, or how higher education is villainized as something that's really just that for the elite, which it's in some respects actually become for a lot of reasons, both from an economic standpoint as well as a completely out of touch standpoint in some of the things that are engaging. But my point is that this overall breakdown of institutions to the final point where we're not even literally trusting science or doctors to tell us what to do on the healthcare side. That overall breakdown, I think, is that erosion has been happening, and then we see an attempted overthrow of the government, or people thinking that an entire election was stolen, and we isolate that as an individual incident, and all these things are interrelated. And where we need to start addressing is in this more macro discussion about these individual issues that are leading to that. I mean, in some respects, I tried to put myself, as you had mentioned, Kevin, in these listening sessions of what would radicalize me to the point where I'm going to the House of Government, right, to the people's house, and trying to stop the certification of an election. And I think that if you truly believe through your entire ecosystem, right, from your faith institutions to your media ecosystem to your friend network to everything that you're engaging in, that all the things that are being said have actually happened, then you actually feel like you're there to save the country, right? I mean, there's the irony, right? Then the other side. And as has come up in some of these trials, folks have been, as they've had time to reflect, i.e. they're sitting in jail, I mean, they're literally saying, I believe this stuff. I mean, and to some of them, actually, I understand it. It doesn't justify it. I mean, it doesn't justify the killing of a police officer. It doesn't justify, the things that folks that were doing by any stretch. But I think the context actually really matters in this overall institutional erosion. And these things have lived in relative harmony, with Walter Cronkite reading you the news, or faith institutions. Maybe I didn't necessarily agree with some of the teachings at the end of the day, but just some folks have provided a moral code or compass, but now it's becoming weaponized and politicized to, I didn't really question the books that I was choosing in my elementary public school. And now you can't even have a book that talks about history without it being questioned as to what history means anymore. I think that erosion of things leads to then, when you need to be trusted in a crisis situation, it's not there. That's a long way of me saying, you would ask this question about whether I've been in those conversations. I said, at the end of the day, when the whatever hits the fan, there needs to be somebody that somebody turns to and says, well, they're the authority. Right now, that is leaderless because of these other issues. And that, I think, is problematic. That actually gives an opening for our adversaries. That gives an opening, I would submit, actually, for success of the Republican Party electorally. Like they succeed in generating chaos and cynicism because the way that they're viewed as the anti-establishment institution, interestingly, through narrative creation, not through reality. And I don't have an answer for this, but I think that we don't talk about the broad erosion of institutions enough as leading to some of these other challenges we had, because we just look at individual instances and say, how could that have happened? And I think that should be a broader discussion.
And this, again, this to me is the pragmatic, real world importance of the moral dimension, because one reason people have lost faith in institutions is the loss of this shared moral narrative. And this is a condition of the modern age since the Enlightenment, right? When reason and science took over from tradition and religion. It used to be that in Western countries, you were a Christian, and you were not only a Christian, but you were a member of one particular church, like the Church of England, until fairly recently was the official church still of Great Britain. And that's all gone. So people are left to kind of make it up for themselves or line up behind somebody who claims to provide all the moral answers, which is another thing the right does a lot. But I think also we see that on the intolerant left as well. It all comes down to, I think, people need to have some sense of what the morality is. And when that's missing, it's not just a nice to have. It's actually essential to the functioning of a society, let alone politics. I also wanted to get back to what you said, Kevin, about your days at the Department of Justice, and I remember those days very well. Again, from the more local side of that issue, and the importance, when you say listening, this is another one of those things where cynical people, I think, would say, oh, that's one of those political platitudes. But it has a real important practical value, aside from it being the morally right thing to do. if you, and this is what you were saying, I think, somebody comes to you and says, well, I happen to know the whole U.S. government is just, this Department of Justice, sure, Department of Injustice, it's all just dirty, racist cops, et cetera, or however they look at it. People on the right now who think the FBI needs to be dismantled or all judges are corrupt. If you argue with them and tell them they're wrong to feel that way, if you don't start by listening and recognizing what's causing their fear and their pain, in the case of that mother who'd lost a child, if you just tell her, oh no, there are good people here, and you're mistaken about that. Not only is that not compassionate, but it ends up not working well. I think you have to start with understanding, why does this person, set aside whether you think they're right on the facts or not. Why do they feel this way? And acknowledge the way they're feeling. And I think by not paying attention to that, this is something that I think Democrats have, in some cases, developed a tin ear over, especially as they've become better and better educated and tended to get stuck in their heads, in my view. Don't start the conversation with telling people why they're wrong. Start it with finding out what they're feeling and why they feel that way.
I think that's right. But I think that the challenge here is to also do that in the instances where you really don't agree. Right. And I think, look, I don't want to speak for Zach, but part of what I heard him say was, even though we don't agree at all with any of the tactics used on January 6th, he was, through the reporting on folks having reflections on their actions, what we're hearing is they felt as though they were there because in their ecosystem, they were hearing that the election was stolen and they were being wronged and they feel forgotten. And I think even though we don't agree with the actions being used on that day, I think it's still important to listen to what they're saying, because those happen to be the people who were caught. But I think that sentiment was obviously shared by the multitude of people that showed up on that day. And even if you don't agree with the tactic, the tactics were deplorable and un-American. I think it's, by my own standard and what I believe, I think that we need to recognize that those feelings are out there and figure out ways for us to address those feelings and create these forums for discussion. And I think, again, there was so many insights that I got from doing that, doing a national tour around community policing and building community trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And one of the biggest things, again, talking about humanity, was law enforcement, the vast majority of law enforcement, they do what they do because they want to serve people and they want to help. They want the communities that they serve to be safe, right? There is a feeling in many in the communities that we were talking to where they believe the opposite. But everybody wants to feel safe. Everyone that we spoke to when we got them at the same table, from the pastor to the young person at the community center to police chief and several officers, we made sure there was vast representation in the room. Everyone wanted to feel safe. And at its core, they didn't want to hate each other. And I think in that, and having and this is the real thing when it comes to, choosing the right type of leadership. This is going to different conversations we've had over the last few podcasts. This is why some, the current option that Republicans are putting forward, Jim Jordan, isn't a viable option, because he's been against just about everything. He's been against his folks from his own party, and destruction can't be the plan forward, right? You need to have someone who's going to be a convener and be able to bring at least someone from the other side to the table to figure out how we can move forward as a country. Because even though you may have a different ideology, you may have a different political philosophy, we are all Americans. We are all on the same team. And I think when that, again, humanity, and then also understanding that we're on the same team is at the center of these decisions, or at least choosing leadership that understands that, I think we'll be in a much better place. And this, look, we've been talking about, the impact of these decisions at the very local level and at the national level. But when America doesn't show up, this has a global impact. And then you create spaces, we're worried about, not having the right leadership and creating space for, far right Republicans to, fill that space, or Trump Republicans to fill that space. That's one thing. I think if we don't show up as a country in a way that we need to, we are creating space for, whether it be, other countries that, to kind of fill that space in a way that wouldn't be ideal.
Yeah, the situation as we speak with the Israel-Hamas war, it's certainly not something we can sort through as we're talking now. But I think that it's an example of morality is the process rather than the result in a lot of cases. You're striving for a moral result, of course. But you don't go in dictating what you're sure is the right answer. And I think that this is something that Joe Biden is doing really well. And I can step back, from my partisan views as a Democrat. I'm fairly confident that I'm not blinded by my preferences on policy. If he were not doing a good job, I'd be okay with saying that. He, I think, is doing such a good job. I'd like to hear how you guys think about that, just from within the context of our topic today, if you have any thoughts about that. But in approaching one of the most difficult imaginable moral challenges for a leader, and his core message throughout is really quite simple, that the value of every human life is precious. And he and, I think Anthony Blinken and the rest of the administration involved in this, I don't know firsthand. I'm watching this from the outside, but it looks to me like this is another case where you can agree or not with the decisions they're making, but it looks to me like the moral considerations are absolutely central to what they're doing. Again, whether you agree with where that ends up or not, I just think it's naive to think that that's not absolutely central to what they're doing.
Look, I'll just say briefly, as I know that we're coming to a bit of a close here, but that I think that President Biden won in part in a fiercely divided electorate. I don't know that we're a divided nation, interestingly. I think we're just a divided electorate in a way, because there were enough Republican folks that felt that he was a decent person. I mean, remember, you're talking 11,000 votes, 17,000 votes, 22,000 votes, right? I mean, these are close states. But I think that his approach and his unquestionable moral compass for decency made him president of the United States in a really divided electorate. I mean, we can look at other things and young voter turnout, and I mean, none of these things are causal, but without enough of these flipped voters, and it was really small, but 1/2 of 1 percentage point in Michigan and Georgia made the difference. And I think that that's what it was. When I traveled with him extensively in 2008 in Pennsylvania, and then when I was with him when my district in California suffered catastrophic damage this year, I can say that where his strength is at the human level, I mean, you could not name another American politician in history that suffered the kind of personal loss that he's had. There's been others that have suffered losses, Kennedy's, Lincoln, I mean, no question, but the extent that he's been through and continue to go through, and his ability to understand human suffering and go to the right place is an amazing element. And I think because of that, because they can't attack, meaning the right can't attack him on that, they create other caricature issues. And questions about age, questions about, his oratory, abilities and et cetera, that are really just red herring issues in many respects. Whereas because they can't attack him on, he's a fundamentally good dude. There's the quote, right? I mean, he just is. And when I watched him, however many years later, sitting in my own district in California, driving his Secret Service detail crazy because he refused to leave with anybody that wanted to talk to him and tell their personal story. This is the president of the United States. This is the leader of the free world. And you would have thought he had the entire time of the world in order to ensure that somebody's issue was addressed. So, yeah, I think that he is morally driven. I think for a future podcast, we should talk about his electoral accomplishments because for whatever reason, the world doesn't know about them, but they are massive. I mean,
Enormous.
They really are. I mean, it's unbelievable. I'm
And
glad
largely
he was
because,
the one.
Zach, sorry to interrupt, but again, the practical value of paying attention to the moral dimension, Biden gets these bipartisan accomplishments done in one of the most divided Congresses in history, with people on the other side who will be severely punished for being seen to do anything that involves cooperating with Democrats, and yet he somehow gets it done. That has to be related to decades of trust that he's built up through being basically a good person.
I'm sure it is. I mean, look, they've blown through a couple of speakers of the House as a result. He's one of them as a result of somebody who, quote unquote, worked with him. Or as Kevin said in the last podcast, for doing the minimum requirement, literally, of the job, which is just keeping the damn government open. It's like not even impressive, But I mean, these guys can't even choose somebody to run their meetings right now. I mean, it's like, and we're asking them they got life and death decisions, and they literally can't even. Like my 8-year-old tells me that one thing that frustrates him at recess is when it takes him longer than 30 seconds to determine who the captains are for tag. And these guys can't even. They literally can't choose somebody to run the meetings. It's like unreal. But hey, they got the keys right now to that kingdom, and so that's what we got to deal with. But yeah, back to Biden and the morality that he really, he's a unique figure. History is going to judge him very differently than we are right now. History is going to judge him as one of the more, this is going to be shocking to hear this, I guess, but one of the most accomplished presidents in American history. And he deserves it. I mean, I'm glad that he's the person, he's the right time, right place, right person.
Yeah, that's my experience being around Biden as well, to the extent that I was, which was mostly 2008, and then maybe once or twice afterwards. Just obviously a good person.
Kevin, why don't you close this out with some brilliance here?
No, I think both you and Spencer, I think you ended it really well. If you get me to talking about alternatives to incarceration programs and juvenile justice, we'd be here for another hour. So
we should talk about that.
We definitely could. I'll have too much to say.
Always great to talk to both of you. Thanks so much. And I guess we'll have to stop this now rather than turn it into some kind of 24-hour telethon.
Well, hey, we're raising money for good things. Let's keep going. But it was an honor to be back on, Spencer. Thanks for having me.
Same here. Thanks to you both.
All right, take care.